Ryan Carter sat in his office, staring at the latest customer feedback reports, his stomach twisting with unease. As the CEO of Carter's Coffee, a once beloved coffee shop chain, he had built the business from the ground up, turning a single cafe into a successful franchise with locations across the city. On paper, things looked great. Sales were steady, expansion plans were in motion, and investors were pleased. But lately the cracks had started to show. Complaints about rude employees, long wait times, and poor management had been piling up. Loyal customers were frustrated, and negative reviews were starting to affect the company's reputation. Ryan had always prided himself on creating a positive workplace culture, but he had to admit he had become disconnected. It had been years since he worked behind the counter or interacted with his frontline employees. These days, his time was consumed by board meetings, expansion strategies, and financial reports. If he truly wanted to understand what was happening inside his stores, he needed to see it firsthand. That's when he made a bold decision. No more relying on reports, no more filtered information from upper management. He would go undercover as a new barista at one of his locations to experience the daily challenges firsthand. He had no idea what he would find, but something in his gut told him that whatever was happening inside those cafes was far worse than he had imagined. It was time to step out of the boardroom and back onto the front lines. Dressed in a simple polo shirt, jeans, and a name tag that read Ryan, trainee, Ryan Carter walked through the doors of one of his downtown Carter's Coffee locations, blending in as just another new hire. He had told Melissa Cheng, his regional manager, that he wanted to personally assess training procedures, though he had left out the part about going fully undercover. His goal was simple: observe, listen, and understand what was happening behind the counter, away from boardroom reports and scripted store visits. The moment he stepped behind the counter, however, he felt the tension in the air. The shop was chaotic. Baristas scrambled to keep up with a never-ending rush of impatient customers. Machines whirred and beeped, and the smell of burnt espresso and frustration filled the air. Almost immediately, he noticed Lena Parker, a barista in her mid-20s, juggling multiple tasks at once, taking orders, preparing drinks, and calling out names, all while her manager Derek Sullivan stood at the back, arms crossed, barking orders like a drill sergeant. "Nina, move faster. You think customers want to wait all day?" Derek's voice cut through the shop like a knife, loud enough for patrons to hear. Lena didn't argue, just nodded quickly and rushed to keep up, her expression one of quiet exhaustion. Ryan watched as she tried to help a teenage coworker, Josh Ramirez, who was struggling to steam milk properly. "Come on, Josh. Are you useless or just stupid?" Derek snapped. Josh flinched, mumbling an apology. Ryan clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay in character. He couldn't blow his cover. Not yet. As Ryan was given his first few training tasks, he realized just how little actual training was happening. Lena was doing her best to show him how to take orders, but every time she tried to explain something, Derek interrupted with criticism. "No time for hand-holding," Derek sneered. "Figure it out, rookie." Customers were growing visibly frustrated. Orders were mixed up, drinks sat on the counter long after being called, and nobody seemed to care. Except for Lena. She was the only one making an effort to smooth over customer complaints, apologizing for delays and remaking drinks when necessary, despite being overwhelmed herself. Ryan took mental notes of every red flag. No teamwork, no support, no leadership. Employees weren't just struggling, they were afraid. He overheard a whispered conversation between two baristas on break. "I can't afford to quit, but I swear, if Derek yells at me one more time, don't bother complaining. Corporate doesn't care." Ryan's gut twisted. Corporate, that was him. And if this was how his employees felt, it meant he had failed them. Things only got worse during the afternoon rush. A customer complained about a missing pastry, and when Lena tried to fix the issue, Derek snatched the bag from her hands. "You screw up everything," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Ryan to hear. Ryan had seen enough. This wasn't just bad management, it was abusive. He had planned to observe quietly, but watching Derek humiliate his employees in front of customers made it almost impossible to hold his tongue. Instead, he took a deep breath, focused on the bigger picture, and made a mental note. Tomorrow, he'd come back, not as a barista, but as a customer. He needed to see how Derek acted when he wasn't being watched. He needed more evidence before he could make his move. The next day, Ryan returned to the cafe, this time as a customer. Dressed casually with the baseball cap pulled low, he ordered a simple black coffee and took a seat near the counter, close enough to observe without drawing attention. The morning rush had already begun, and within minutes it became painfully obvious that nothing had changed. Employees moved mechanically, exhausted and disengaged. The few who worked hard, like Lena and Josh, were overburdened, while others lingered near the supply shelves, avoiding work. Derek, the manager, stood by the espresso machine, arms crossed, watching but not helping. Then the moment came that pushed Ryan over the edge. Lena, rushing between making drinks and handling orders, grabbed a tray of iced coffees to deliver to a waiting customer. The cafe was packed, the pressure high, and in her haste, her foot caught on the edge of a mat behind the counter. Before she could steady herself, the tray tipped forward, sending the drinks crashing onto the floor. The sound of shattering plastic cups and splattering liquid froze the room. For a brief second, there was silence, until Derek's booming voice shattered it. "Are you kidding me, Lena?" he barked, storming toward her. "Do you have any idea how much product you just wasted?" Lena, already kneeling to clean up the mess, kept her head down. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "Sorry doesn't fix incompetence," Derek snapped, his voice loud enough that several customers turned to watch. "Maybe if you actually paid attention instead of rushing like a damn idiot, this wouldn't happen. I swear, you're more of a liability than an employee." Ryan watched in disbelief. It wasn't just what Derek said, it was how he said it. The public humiliation, the belittling tone, the way Lena's shoulders hunched as if she expected worse. And yet, she didn't argue. She didn't defend herself, she simply cleaned up the mess as quickly as possible, hands trembling. Ryan's hands curled into fists beneath the table. A few customers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable, but no one said anything. One older woman at a nearby table shook her head in disapproval but continued sipping her coffee. Ryan couldn't believe what he was witnessing. As if the verbal attack wasn't enough, Derek turned toward the rest of the staff, scoffing. "This is exactly why I don't put certain people on important tasks," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Ryan's stomach twisted. He knew what Derek meant. He wasn't just talking about Lena's mistake. He was dismissing her entirely, treating her like she didn't belong, like she was a problem rather than an employee who was overworked and unsupported. Ryan had seen enough. Pushing back his chair, he stood up abruptly, his coffee forgotten. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he marched toward the counter. Derek, still smirking, barely glanced at him. "You need something, buddy?" Ryan kept his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. "Yeah, actually, I do." Derek rolled his eyes, assuming Ryan was another impatient customer. "If it's about your order, we're backed up." "This isn't about my order." Ryan's sharp tone cut him off. He looked Derek straight in the eye. "It's about how you treat your employees." Derek blinked. He clearly hadn't expected pushback. "Excuse me?" Ryan glanced at Lena, who was still crouched on the floor, avoiding eye contact. He felt a surge of anger, not at her but at the culture of fear that had been allowed to thrive in his business. He turned back to Derek. "Do you think humiliating your employees in front of customers makes you a better manager?" Derek scoffed, but Ryan noticed the flicker of unease in his eyes. "Look, man, I don't know who you think you are, but I run this store. If you don't like it, go get your coffee somewhere else." Ryan's jaw tightened. Not yet. He wasn't going to reveal himself. Not here, not like this. He needed to see just how deep the rot went. "Sure," Ryan said, forcing himself to stay calm. "But don't think for a second this conversation is over." Derek smirked, waving him off. "Whatever, man." Ryan glanced once more at Lena before walking toward the exit. As he stepped outside, he knew what he had to do. This wasn't just bad management, it was toxic leadership. And if this was happening at one store, there was a good chance it was happening elsewhere. Tomorrow, he would return, not as a customer, not as an employee, but as the CEO. It was time to take back control of his company. The next morning, Ryan arrived at Carter's Coffee with a new plan. This time, he wasn't coming in as a barista or a customer. He was going in as a food delivery driver. He had borrowed a uniform from a local delivery service, complete with a branded cap and a large thermal bag slung over his shoulder. This disguise would allow him to move in and out of the cafe freely, blending in without drawing suspicion. He needed to see more, to understand if Derek's toxic behavior was an isolated incident or a symptom of a larger problem. As he stepped inside, the atmosphere felt just as tense as before. The morning rush was in full swing, and the stress in the air was palpable. Employees moved frantically, their expressions tight with exhaustion and frustration. The smell of fresh espresso and pastries didn't mask the underlying anxiety radiating from the team. Ryan scanned the room, his eyes landing on Josh, the young employee from the day before, who was struggling to carry a large box of milk cartons into the back storage area. Josh's face was red with exertion, his thin arms shaking under the weight. Just as he nearly lost his grip, Derek's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. "Come on, Josh, you're moving like an old man. Are you seriously this weak?" Derek stood near the espresso machine, arms crossed, watching but not helping. Josh mumbled an apology and adjusted his grip, clearly pushing himself beyond his limits. Ryan clenched his fists inside his jacket pocket. This wasn't just bad management. It was outright abuse. Ryan approached Josh as he set the box down with a heavy thud. "Hey, you all right?" Ryan asked casually, keeping his tone light. Josh looked up, startled. Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Ryan lowered his voice. "Is he always like that?" He nodded toward Derek, who was now berating another barista for moving too slowly. Josh hesitated, then shrugged, his eyes darting nervously. "Pretty much. It's worse when it's busy, but, we need the job, so we just deal with it." Ryan felt a sting of guilt. His employees weren't just overworked, they were afraid. Afraid to speak up, afraid to lose their hours, afraid of being publicly humiliated. This was not the culture he had built his company on. Determined to gather more, Ryan slipped toward the back storage area, where he spotted Lena restocking shelves. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up in faint recognition. "Hey, you're back," she said cautiously. "Need something?" Ryan glanced toward the cafe floor before speaking. "I was here yesterday," he admitted. "I saw how Derek treated you. Has it always been like that?" Lena stiffened, her eyes darting toward the doorway as if expecting Derek to burst in at any moment. "Look, I don't want any trouble," she said quickly, turning back to the shelf. "I just do my job and try to stay out of his way." "You shouldn't have to stay out of his way," Ryan said, his voice firm. Lena sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's not just me. He's hard on everyone. But we don't say anything because we need the hours. If we complain, he'll cut our shifts. It's not like corporate cares." Ryan's chest tightened. She didn't know it, but she had just told the CEO of Carter's Coffee that corporate didn't care. He nodded slowly, absorbing everything she had said. "Thank you for telling me," he said after a moment. "I promise. Things are going to change." Lena let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "I'll believe it when I see it." Ryan didn't blame her for doubting him. Corporate had failed them. He had failed them. But that was about to change. That evening, Ryan sat in his office flipping through store reports from all 10 Carter's Coffee locations. The more he read, the more his frustration grew. Long wait times, high turnover, complaints about rude management. The problems weren't isolated to one store. They were company-wide. He grabbed his phone and sent a message to Melissa Chang, his regional manager. "Emergency meeting first thing tomorrow. We have a serious problem." He had all the evidence he needed. Now it was time to act. The next morning, Ryan Carter walked into Carter's Coffee not as a barista, not as a customer, and not as a delivery driver, but as the CEO. Dressed in his usual button-down shirt and blazer, he stepped into the cafe with purpose, his eyes scanning the room. Employees moved around the counter, preparing drinks and taking orders, oblivious to the fact that their boss had just walked in. But when Derek Sullivan, the manager, looked up from his phone, his face froze. "Ryan," Derek blurted out, straightening his posture. What are you doing here?" Ryan ignored the question. "Let's talk," he said firmly, nodding toward the back office. Derek hesitated, glancing around as if searching for an escape. The cafe had fallen completely silent, employees pausing in their tasks, their eyes darting between the two men. Inside the cramped office, Ryan closed the door behind them, then turned to face Derek with an expression devoid of patience. "I spent 2 days undercover in this store," Ryan said, his voice calm but unyielding. "I saw everything. The way you treat your employees, the way you humiliate them in front of customers, the way you abuse your authority. And I'm telling you right now, this ends today." Derek's face went pale. He opened his mouth, scrambling for an excuse. "Look, I was just keeping things running smoothly. You know how hard it is to find decent workers." Ryan cut him off. "Stop." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a cold edge. "You don't respect your employees, and that reflects poorly on this company. And as of this moment, you are no longer a part of it." Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Wait, what? You're firing me?" Ryan nodded once, effective immediately. "Collect your things and leave." Derek stammered, his arrogance crumbling. "You can't be serious." Ryan didn't respond. He simply stepped aside and opened the door. The meaning was clear. Defeated, Derek stormed past him, his face red with humiliation. As he emerged from the office, employees stared in shock, whispering amongst themselves. For the first time, Derek had no power. Ryan stepped forward, addressing the staff. "Listen up." His voice carried across the cafe, commanding attention. "I built this company to be a place where people love to work, a place where respect, teamwork, and leadership matter. But what I've seen here is the opposite of what I stand for." He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Lena. "Lena," Ryan said, his tone shifting, "I've watched you handle this cafe with more patience, dedication, and leadership than the man who was supposed to be running it." He took a breath before continuing. "I'm promoting you to shift supervisor, effective today, and I'll be increasing your pay to reflect that." Lena's eyes widened. "Wait? What?" Ryan smiled. "You've earned it." A wave of whispers and murmurs spread through the cafe, but the overwhelming reaction was relief, and for the first time, hope. Ryan turned back to the team. "There are going to be changes starting now. Fairer schedules, better training, and a safer environment for everyone. You all deserve better, and if any manager treats you unfairly, you have my direct line." The tension in the room finally broke. A few employees smiled, others exchanged glances of disbelief. Lena blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. Ryan exhaled, his chest lighter than it had been in years. He had come here expecting to find problems, but he had also found solutions. And this was just the beginning. After dealing with Derek and promoting Lena, Ryan Carter knew that fixing one store wasn't enough. The problem was bigger than just one bad manager. The toxic culture he had seen at this location likely existed in other stores as well. He had spent too much time focused on expansion and profits, trusting his management team to uphold the company's values. But the truth was clear now. Somewhere along the way, he had lost control. Back at corporate headquarters, Ryan called an emergency meeting with Melissa Cheng, his regional manager, and the rest of the leadership team. As they filed into the conference room, their faces were filled with curiosity and concern. Some had likely heard rumors about what had happened at the cafe, but no one was prepared for what Ryan was about to say. "Let me make something clear," Ryan began, standing at the head of the table. His voice was firm, steady. "I've spent the last few days undercover in one of our stores. What I saw was unacceptable. Employees being humiliated, overworked, and ignored. Customers frustrated, managers abusing their power." He scanned the room, letting the weight of his words settle. "This isn't just a one-store issue. It's a company-wide failure, and it starts with us." The room was silent. Melissa shifted in her chair, looking troubled. "Ryan, I visit the stores regularly, and the managers always report that things are running smoothly. I had no idea it was this bad." "That's the problem," Ryan said. "We've relied too much on what we're told instead of seeing things for ourselves. That ends today." He turned to the screen behind him and clicked a button on his laptop. A list of customer complaints and employee feedback reports appeared. Long wait times, high turnover, low employee morale. These weren't isolated issues, they were patterns. We're overhauling the way we run our stores, Ryan continued. Starting immediately, we're implementing 3 major changes. He clicked again and 3 bold bullet points appeared on the screen. Mandatory leadership training. Every store manager would be required to complete an intensive leadership course focused on communication, conflict resolution, and employee engagement. No more unchecked authority, no more abuse. Anonymous employee feedback system. Employees could now report issues directly to corporate without fear of retaliation. Their voices would finally be heard. A new performance-based promotion system. Instead of promotions being based on tenure or favoritism, they would be earned through performance, leadership, and customer satisfaction. Employees like Lena, who actually cared, would be rewarded while poor managers would be held accountable. Melissa nodded slowly, absorbing it all. This is going to shake things up, she admitted. Good, Ryan said. Some managers are going to push back. They'll say we're being too strict, that we're micromanaging, but let me be clear. Anyone who doesn't treat their employees with respect doesn't deserve to be a leader in this company. The weight of his words hung in the air. He could see some nervous glances exchanged around the table. There were undoubtedly managers on thin ice, and they knew it. Melissa exhaled. All right, let's do this. I'll send out notices and start rolling out the training programs. Ryan nodded. I'll personally visit every store over the next 2 weeks. I want to see firsthand if things are improving, and if any manager thinks they can keep doing things the old way, they won't be working here much longer. The message was clear. The culture at Carter's Coffee was changing, and anyone who wasn't on board would no longer have a place in the company. That evening, as Ryan sat in his office scrolling through the first anonymous employee feedback submissions, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time, he wasn't just running a business, he was fixing it. The moment Ryan Carter stepped out of the cafe that morning, he knew that firing one bad manager wasn't enough. He had to rebuild the company culture from the ground up. What he had witnessed firsthand wasn't just a case of one toxic store. It was a systemic issue that had been allowed to grow unchecked while corporate focused on expansion. His employees weren't failing, the company was failing them. If he wanted Carter's Coffee to be more than just a business, if he wanted it to be a place where people actually wanted to work, he needed real change, not just empty promises. By midday, Ryan was back at corporate headquarters, sitting across from Melissa Cheng, his regional manager, and a few other key members of the leadership team. He placed a thick file of reports and notes onto the table and looked them in the eye. I've been to the stores, I've worked behind the counter, I've listened to the employees, he began, his tone calm but firm. And what I saw was unacceptable. Employees being humiliated, ignored, and overworked, while managers stand by doing nothing. Or worse, making it harder for them. And you know what's even worse? He leaned forward. No one here knew it was happening. Melissa's face tightened. Ryan, I check in on the stores regularly. I talk to the managers. And that's the problem, Ryan interrupted, shaking his head. We've been listening to managers instead of employees. We've relied on filtered reports instead of getting on the ground ourselves. We assumed things were running fine because the numbers looked good. But the numbers don't tell us how employees feel when they walk into work every day. The room fell silent. The leadership team shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. So here's what's going to change, Ryan continued, pulling out a printed agenda. Starting today, we're rolling out 3 major initiatives. He clicked a button on the projector behind him, and 3 bold bullet points appeared on the screen. Effective immediately, every store manager will go through mandatory leadership training. This isn't just about running operations, it's about how they treat people. I want them to learn conflict resolution, communication, and employee engagement. Because what I saw at that store was not leadership, it was abuse. Melissa nodded, taking notes. We'll need to bring in a specialist for that. Already working on it, Ryan replied, and any manager who refuses the training, they're out, no exceptions. The reason this went unnoticed for so long is because employees were too afraid to speak up. That changes today. We're launching an anonymous feedback system, one that goes directly to corporate, bypassing store managers. If an employee feels unsafe overworked, or mistreated, they will have a voice. A murmur ran through the room. Some managers looked uneasy, and Ryan knew exactly why. If any manager retaliates against employees for speaking up, they won't get a warning, he added. They'll be fired. Too many promotions in this company have been based on tenure, favoritism, or convenience. That stops now. From here on out, promotions will be based on actual performance, leadership, and customer satisfaction. Employees like Lena, who actually care about their work, should be the ones getting promoted, not the ones who just sit in an office. Melissa glanced at him, a flicker of realization crossing her face. You're talking about Derek? I'm talking about every manager like him in this company, Ryan clarified. The ones who think power is about control, not leadership. The weight of his words settled over the room. Melissa took a deep breath. This is going to upset some people, Ryan. Not every manager is going to be on board with these changes. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his expression unshaken. Then they're free to leave. For a long moment, no one spoke, and then, one by one, the leadership team nodded. Melissa tapped her pen against the table. All right, I'll start drafting a company-wide announcement. Leadership training will roll out next month. The feedback system can be in place by the end of the week. Good, Ryan said, because I'll be personally visiting every store over the next 2 weeks. I want to see firsthand who's willing to adapt and who's holding this company back. That night, Ryan sat in his office, scrolling through the first few messages from the new employee feedback system. Most were short, cautious. But one stood out. For the first time in years, I feel like someone at the top actually cares. Ryan let out a slow breath, his grip tightening on his phone. This wasn't about saving his company. It was about making it something worth saving. A month later, Ryan Carter walked through the doors of the same Carter's Coffee location, but this time the atmosphere was noticeably different. The tension that had once hung in the air like a storm cloud was gone, replaced by something that had been missing before: energy. Employees moved with purpose, customers smiled as they received their orders, and the entire cafe felt alive in a way it never had during Ryan's first visit. He took a seat in the corner, watching as Lena Parker, now wearing a manager's uniform, took an order with ease, chatting briefly with a customer before stepping over to check on the baristas. The team worked smoothly, their movements efficient but not frantic. Ryan noticed Josh Ramirez, the teenage worker who had once struggled under Derek's leadership, laughing with a coworker as he prepped drinks. The sight made Ryan's chest tighten. This was the kind of workplace he had envisioned when he started Carter's Coffee. As Lena walked by, she caught sight of him and hesitated, then approached, her expression a mix of surprise and caution. "Mr. Carter," she said, glancing around nervously, "I wasn't expecting you today." "I wanted to see how things were going," Ryan replied, motioning to the bustling cafe. "Looks like you've been busy." Lena let out a breath, then nodded. "It's been better. At first, people were skeptical. We were so used to being overworked and ignored that it was hard to believe anything would change. But when corporate actually followed through on the training, the feedback system, and the new scheduling policies, people started to believe." Ryan leaned forward. "And you? How's it been for you?" Lena hesitated, then smiled, a real, genuine smile, not the forced, weary one he had seen before. "For the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm just surviving the day. I actually love my job." Ryan felt a swell of pride and relief. He had spent so much time fixing numbers, growing profits, and expanding locations that he had forgotten the most important part of his company, the people. A voice from the counter interrupted their conversation. "Excuse me, ma'am, my order is missing fries." Lena turned without hesitation, her tone calm and professional. "I'll handle it right away," she said with a quick nod, before heading to the kitchen. Ryan watched her go, a small smile forming. She wasn't just managing the store, she was leading it. As he stood up to leave, he knew this was just the beginning. There were still other stores to fix, other employees to empower, but this was proof that change was possible. And for the first time in years, he knew his company was moving in the right direction. 3 months later, Ryan Carter stood at the front of a packed conference room inside Carter's Coffee headquarters. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation as over 100 store managers from across the company sat before him. This wasn't just any corporate meeting, It was mandatory. Every regional leader, store manager, and supervisor had been summoned to what Ryan had titled the Leadership Reset Summit. Behind him, a large screen displayed two bold words: Reset Culture. Ryan took a slow breath, then gripped the podium. "When I founded Carter's Coffee," he began, his voice steady but firm, "I wanted to build a company where both customers and employees felt valued. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that." He paused, scanning the room. "And that's on me." A ripple of silence passed through the audience. Some managers shifted uncomfortably, while others sat stone-faced, waiting to see where this was going. 3 months ago, I went undercover in one of our stores," Ryan continued, his tone sharpening. "I saw firsthand what many of you probably already knew. Employees were overworked, disrespected, and ignored. Customers were frustrated. Morale was at an all-time low." He let his words settle before adding, "That is not leadership." The screen behind him shifted, displaying a list of initiatives already implemented. Anonymous employee feedback system in place. Mandatory leadership training, 80% completion rate. Employee satisfaction ratings increased by 30%. "These aren't just numbers," Ryan said. "These are proof that we are rebuilding trust. But let me be clear, this is just the starting point." He gestured toward the back of the room, where Lena Parker sat beside Melissa Chang. "Lena," Ryan said with a nod, "would you join me up here?" Lena hesitated for half a second, then stood, walking to the podium with a steady stride. She adjusted the blazer she now wore, a stark contrast to the stained apron she had once worn behind the counter. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face the room. "Hi everyone," she began. "I used to be a barista at one of our stores. For a long time, I felt invisible. No matter how hard I worked, it didn't seem to matter. And my manager," she glanced toward Ryan before continuing, "he made sure I knew I didn't belong." A few managers shifted in their seats. Others stared ahead, unblinking. "But then something changed," Lena continued. "Someone listened, and now I run that store," she smiled. "And I can tell you, the changes we're making, they're real." The room erupted in applause. Ryan stepped back to the podium. "Lena's story is proof that leadership is about more than just authority. It's about respect, accountability, and trust." He let that sink in. "The next 6 months will define who really belongs here." His voice was firm. "Great leaders will rise, bad ones will step aside. The choice is yours." The message was clear. Carter's Coffee was never going back to the way things were. As the Leadership Reset Summit concluded, Ryan Carter lingered near the back of the room, watching as managers discussed the changes amongst themselves. Some looked eager, others hesitant, but the energy in the room was undeniable. People were paying attention. They knew this wasn't just another corporate initiative that would fade away. This was real. Later that evening, Ryan sat alone in his office, scrolling through the latest employee feedback submissions. Some messages were simple acknowledgments of better schedules and training, but one stood out. "For the first time in years, I feel like someone at the top actually cares." Ryan exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Those words meant everything. This wasn't just about fixing a company, it was about building something better, something he could be proud of again. The past few months had taught him an invaluable lesson. Profits didn't make a company successful. People did. His phone buzzed. A message from Lena. "Thanks for believing in me. I won't let you down." Ryan smiled. As he turned off his office lights, he knew this was just the beginning. Carter's Coffee wasn't just changing its policies, it was changing its culture. And this time, he would never lose sight of what truly mattered. The story of Ryan Carter is a powerful reminder that true leadership isn't about titles, it's about heart. It's about having the courage to listen, to take responsibility, and to stand up for the people who keep a company running. When Ryan went undercover, he didn't just see a struggling workplace. He saw real people, exhausted and unheard, giving their all without recognition. He realized that when leaders disconnect, trust is broken, and a company's culture suffers. But more importantly, he learned that change starts from the top. A business isn't just about profits, it's about the people who make it thrive. Respect, fairness, and empowerment aren't just policies, They're the soul of a healthy workplace. Because at the end of the day, a company's true success is measured by how it values its people,